You load your full application on the first page load, and then from that point on, you're simply dynamically changing content on the web page. So, if you're not reloading the whole page, then you're obviously it's a lot faster, it's a lot more responsive, so it gives an overall better experience. An excellent example of a single-page application is your Gmail app, right? Everyone's used Gmail over here. When you go through different emails, you don't see the whole page refreshing, just the email content changes, and it's really fast, really fluid. It's very nice to use. This project was started, the initial version was released in 2010, and it's been open source, and it's something that's been worked on by Google. So there's a team at Google who's working on this, and Google uses this for their own projects internally. One of the projects that's been heavily used by Angular is the Google Cloud Computing project. So all the interface is made in Angular. Their code base is over 140,000 lines of code. So very complex application, and it's all done in Angular. I mentioned two versions here for Angular. There's Angular 1, which is at 1.5.8 right now, and Angular 2. I'll talk about this a bit later, but they're mentioned because Angular 1 and Angular 2 are slightly different. They're not directly compatible. So people who are at the moment using Angular 1 should just make sure that using the latest version and the latest conventions that are with Angular 1. So what makes Angular awesome? My personally favorite thing is the architecture that comes out of the box. So when you start making an application, you start with usually one file. It's a single JavaScript file, and then you grow your application from there. It's very hard to see where your application will end up in 3 months' time or 1 year's time. And what you need to prepare is scalability, because your application can have 100 files after 6 months. And essentially what Angular does is it gives you that structure for your application that is very scalable, so that it doesn't matter how big your code base becomes, you can always keep scaling. Another very good part about Angular is the modularity and the testability of your code. So essentially Angular focuses very heavily on breaking down your application into very small components. And that is useful because when everything is broken down into small components, you can test those individual components in isolation and also make sure that your code is working properly. There are other features that are pretty common with other frameworks, stuff like two-way binding, where if you want to update your HTML from JavaScript, Angular does that for you, and vice versa. If you want to track events in your HTML that make changes into your JavaScript, I'll just show you guys how that happens in a bit. There's a very awesome templating engine with Angular 2. Actually, it compiles down into JavaScript, and so essentially it's really fast, and it has all that functionality that you might need for adding conditionals and looping. Another useful thing that's related to testing is dependency injection. Essentially, again, it's all about isolating your code into small components, and dependency injection allows you to bring your modules together to include other components into your application. So this essentially helps you to mock your dependencies when you're testing, and it's a really good architecture. It's a very good pattern to use in your architecture. And of course, at the end of the day, like any other library or framework, it has loads of plug-and-play functionality. Simply go out if you want routing, just drop in the UI router for Angular. It starts working. There's a good library for forms and also a library for HTTP. So we saw that Angular has two main versions, Angular 1 and Angular 2. Angular 2 is unfortunately not directly compatible with Angular 1. It was a complete rewrite that was released just 2 months ago. So why did they have to rewrite Angular 2? And that's basically because there were some structural inefficiencies inside Angular 1 that they could not just get away with a single version change, right? So they had to completely change the architecture. And what that has given us is a very, very fast performance. So right now, performance is 10x faster than Angular 1. This is on par with libraries like React that you see out there. This is happening all because of the virtual DOM. For those of you who don't know, the virtual DOM is essentially a copy of the DOM, the HTML DOM, in memory, and essentially it checks that virtual DOM and calculates the minimum amount of changes needed, and then applies those to the actual DOM. So that means it's really fast. It's using TypeScript. Yesterday, for those who were here for my enterprise talk, that's essentially the future of JavaScript. So we're actually using things already that will come 1 or 2 years later in JavaScript. So it's very futuristic. And stuff like RxJS. RxJS is, again, a new library by Microsoft that is essentially, for those of you who know promises, this is the next generation of that. We have other features like ahead-of-time compilation that essentially compiles. So right now what happens is when your application gets loaded onto your client's browser, it gets compiled over there. So ahead-of-time compilation compiles it before it gets rendered. So when you build your application, it compiles it already. So what that does is it reduces your binary size, so your application becomes very small. So when loading, it becomes very fast to load. So you can decrease your application size up to 3% using AOT. And then there's improved tooling. Angular CLI, I'll show you guys how that looks. Really awesome tool. Augury is a tool used for debugging. Again, these are all things that have come in Angular 2 because they have provided the required hooks for that. And then again, of course, new integrations. You can directly hook Angular 2 into Material 2, Iron 2. Native script, that's essentially the same as React Native, those of you who've heard of that. Universal is, again, a really cool library that allows you to render your code on the server and then ship it down. So again, it's all about how to make your application load faster and be more responsive for the user. This is how, essentially, the Angular 2 architecture looks like. In the middle is your component, and that's essentially your single unit of code that's at that moment being looked at. Your component will have its accompanying template. Your template essentially is the HTML. It is how you define the view in the browser, right? So how it's going to look like. In between, there's the metadata that is essentially telling what's going where. So it's going to have all the different CSS files and any inputs and outputs that you're defining for that particular component. And around it are your bindings. This is the two-way binding I was talking about. So you have property bindings going from the component to the template, which are essentially variables linking to your HTML. And then you have event binding, that is stuff going from your HTML to your JavaScript, or in this case, TypeScript. On the left-hand side, you have the injector, the services essentially, and this is where the dependency injection comes in. So any data that you're bringing across from outside, it's brought in by a service, and that's injected into your component, and then you can inject it into any component and fetch the data or add to it or whatever. On the top, you have the modules, and this is again, this was one of the last things added to Angular 2. And essentially what this does is, it brings together your services and components into bigger groups. So if component is the smallest part of the application, module is the next biggest one. So essentially you're grouping your components and your services by features. And again, it's all about scalability, right? If you have 10,000 components, that's not going to help you. But if you start grouping them into modules, then again, it's manageable and you know how your structure is going to pan out. This also allows us to do stuff like lazy loading. For those, again, lazy loading is a concept where when you load your application, you only load part of it initially, and then when you request a new part, so let's say I'm on the login page and now I'm going to the application page, I then download just the application code off the thing instead of downloading the whole application, which could be very big. Let me show you some cool things about Angular 2 and possibly some nice ways to get started. So the only prerequisite for Angular 2 is Node.js and npm. So we need Node version 4.0 plus. I'm currently on version 7. That's close to the latest version of Node right now. You also need npm that gets installed with Node. That needs to be 3.0 plus. I'm on 3.10. Again, very recent version. In order to install Angular CLI, we use npm install Angular CLI. and this will just install the ng command on your computer. And that's pretty much it. I'm not going to run this command because I already have this. So I'm just going to run ng help, and that will simply list out all the options that I have in the Angular CLI. And you can see there are many options here. I'm going to focus on two.